In a previous video, I mentioned the capillary tissue fluid exchange. This video is about that topic. This diagram represents a capillary bed, and on the arterial side here, blood comes in. Venule side over here. This is the capillary bed. And what happens quite simply is that the arteriole starts to branch into smaller and smaller blood vessels. These are capillaries. And what capillaries are able to do is get the blood right into almost down at a cellular level. So you can see if these are clusters of cells that, you know, each cell might be within 2 or 3 cells away from the blood supply. And of course on the other end these join together and the blood comes back. What happens in here is critical to the survival of the tissues. It's important to remember blood pressure, and as blood pressure gets further and further and further away from the heart, it continues to decrease. The blood pressure on this end is somewhere around 35. Blood pressure is measured in a unit called millimeters of mercury. It's an old unit for pressure, and normal blood pressure, they say, is 120/80. That's an average normal blood pressure. This is the pressure when the heart is contracting. This is when it's between contractions. So if I bring your attention back to a diagram I had a while ago in a different video, if this represents a blood vessel, an artery with blood being pumped through it, this might represent the 120 where the blood pressure is greater, and this part here might represent the blood pressure at 80 where it's there's not as much pressure. 120 millimeters of mercury over 80 millimeters of mercury, typically measured in the brachial artery of the arm. If it were measured closer to the heart, it would be higher. If it were measured further from the heart, it would be lower. This is a normal blood pressure. So by the time the blood gets all the way to the capillary bed, it's lost this fluctuation, 120/80. It can also tell you that this higher number is called the systolic pressure. This one is called the diastolic. Well, by the time the blood gets further and further from the heart, the fluctuation gets diminished and diminished and diminished. And by the time the blood gets to a capillary bed, there is no diastolic and systolic pressure. The blood's just sort of flowing. There's still pressure here, and it's about 35 millimeters of mercury. That's enough that the fluid can be forced out of the capillaries. So these capillaries, if you remember, they're 1 cell thick. The walls are 1 cell thick. So there's enough pressure here to force things into cells. The things, it's water mostly, but the water transports oxygen and it transports nutrients. And that's very valuable. On the other side, on the venule side, as the water leaves, blood pressure continues to decrease. So down on this end, the blood pressure is perhaps around 15 millimeters of mercury. Quite a bit less. The components of blood aren't just water, oxygen, and nutrients. There's cells. The cells stay behind. There's protein. The protein stays behind. Remember the one protein I mentioned before is that protein albumin. It's one that's made by the liver. It's a globule and it's put in the blood. And what it does, it actually contributes to an osmotic pressure. If you take the water out, then the things that are remaining in the blood become more concentrated, so it becomes increasingly hypertonic. A hypertonic environment creates osmotic pressure. Osmotic pressure will draw water back in at this end because the blood pressure is so much lower. So water comes back in on this end. This time the water isn't carrying water, oxygen and nutrients, it's carrying wastes. Typically carbon dioxide and nitrogen. The average, if someone were to ask you what the average pressure in a capillary bed is, it's 25, roughly. This could be 30, this could be 12, but say it's roughly 25. And there is no real net loss of volume. The volume of blood here represents the volume of blood over here. Not 100% true though. There is sometimes a situation where extra fluid gets left out. We've already mentioned the lymphatic system. We mentioned the lymphatic system with respect to the digestive system, lacteals and the villi. The lymphatic system is all over the body, and if there's extra fluid getting left in the tissue spaces, it'll wind up being drawn into the lymphatic system. Lymphatic vessels will take it and it'll go through lymph nodes and eventually get returned to the circulatory system. So the volume, the whole volume of blood doesn't necessarily change. I can add one more little thing to this story, and it has to do with a type of red blood cell that we haven't mentioned yet, but that particular type of red blood cell releases a molecule known as histamines. What histamines do is they actually increase the leakiness of the capillary bed, so extra fluid gets out. And if extra fluid gets out, then the lymphatic system winds up drawing extra fluid back in. This is part of the immune response, which is the topic of an entirely different video, so that's all I'll mention of it right now. Thanks again for watching. And remember, if you'd like to know when my videos get posted, don't forget to subscribe.